Welcome to a Leader's Journey podcast. I'm your host, Joel Gunn, and I've got Josh Arrington back with me. Josh, always a pleasure.
Always fun.
Yeah, looking forward to it. We last time we started to go off on a couple of rabbit trails, and we decided let's just get back in studio again. So here we are. So let's jump right into it. Marketplace ministry. Love it. It's a lot of our viewing audience that's important to them. What is the difference between doing marketplace ministry with biblical mottos versus biblical principles?
Yeah, a phrase I've used before. I would even back up a step before that, and I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. What's the goal of marketplace ministry?
That's a great question. I've met different people have different reasons for doing it. Some feel compelled that that's what they have to do to earn brownie points in heaven. That's not what they've said, but most that I've met do it as out of a genuine concern for people. Like whatever they call it, however they package it, whether it's a care ministry or whether it's a give back program or community involvement kind of thing. It's because whoever, typically the business owner or the senior executive, really has a heart for people having a better life. So I've seen, both extremes.
It's going to feel like I'm the one questioning you for a minute here. So, because I have a second question, and that is the gospel disruptive?
It seems to have been most of the time, yes.
Okay, so then I would take the position that if the gospel is disruptive and you're going to do marketplace ministry where you're bringing the gospel into the marketplace, then your business should be disruptive. You can't have the disruptive power of the gospel enter into the marketplace and suddenly become neutered. So internally and externally, there probably should be some version of disruption. And so I think in business, a lot of times we can arrive at this point where we want to run an ethical business, meaning we're staying in the parameters of what's legal, what's right. We're in this. We're not doing anything usury toward clients or even abusive toward our employees, and therefore we're an ethical business. And we can begin to think that in and of itself, especially if I base some of doing that ethics on biblical passages or biblical mottos, means I'm running a marketplace ministry. I'm a faith-based person. I believe in the power of the gospel. But you're no different than any other ethical company that's out there that's doing the same thing, staying within the legal parameters. And I don't think it's enough to say we're going to do marketplace ministry, have the power of the gospel, be disruptive in how we do our business and in who we do our business for, internally and externally, and expect that just putting some mottos on what already exists in the world is going to make us truly a marketplace ministry. I think when you take the step and go, we're going to run our company by biblical principles, that begins to shift the dynamic exclusively. And I'll give you a first one that I think is a huge example of that. Scripture is really clear. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Mm-hmm. That's way narrower than the legal parameters. Mm-hmm. When you tell an employee something's going to happen and then it doesn't, or you tell a vendor something's going to happen and then it doesn't, the legal world gives you a lot of leeway in there to still be in the ethical realm, but you're no longer in the disruptive, powerful
within
realm
your legal
of
boundaries. But
exactly. And so I think when you say, I'm going to try and run my business by biblical principles, and you start diving into that, then there's not the cost to the owner in the C-suite can become significant, monetarily and otherwise. Because it changes the whole approach. And we could go through a variety of examples on this if you want to. And what are some of those biblical principles that I think set off being a disruptive marketplace ministry? And I say disruptive in a positive sense. Like we run our business differently than others, and being just an ethical company like other ethical companies, but you put some faith-based words around it or some faith-based passages, or we strive for excellence. Well, guess what? There's a bunch of companies out there that strive for excellence, They don't have the do all you do unto the glory of God, but they're trying to be excellent just like you are. So what's the difference? So if we're going to do marketplace ministry, let's really do it so it's a distinctive difference. It should be back to biblical principles. Then the marketplace entity should be salt and light.
You, as you were sharing the yes be yes and no be no, I thought of in Proverbs, there's a verse that says something about swearing to your own hurt kind of concept. And there's a company that I believe it's their mission statement. I love it. It's got kind of a cool cadence to it, almost poetic. It says, we build great boats at a profit if we can, at a loss if we must, but we build great boats. And that starts to sound like a biblical principle, right? In other words, we've promised to you, customer, our promise to you is to build a great boat. Now, we really want to do that at a profit, and we kind of need to. But even if we have to take a loss, you're still going to get a great boat. And I like those kinds of, and how clearly does that communicate to the customers, to the employees, all the stakeholders involved? No, yeah, we're interested in making a profit. But higher than profit is we're going to live up this reputation. We're going to be excellent. And even if it costs us money, you're still going to get a great boat.
Yeah, the biblical call to good stewardship, which I would say goes beyond financial. We've talked about that in the past. The biblical call to good stewardship is actually absolutely there. And so we need to operate with great business principles, and we need to operate to try to make a profit. All of those things are valid and true, but they are secondary in our operations if we're truly doing marketplace ministry to the other attributes of biblical principles that exist. And sometimes if we have to sacrifice one or the other, I think it's really clear what we're supposed to sacrifice. And that's a scary proposition to say that may cost me net revenue, that may cost me things, but do I want to be known as a person of integrity, a person of character, a person whose yes is yes, their no is no, a person who treats others with dignity, respect, in the Imago Dei? I mean, there's another biblical principle we could talk about. The principle that all of us, all of creation is created in the Imago Dei. Not, and I may get in hot water here, but not just, hey, we're a marketplace ministry, meaning we're ethical, we have some biblical principles, and we're going to go down and serve the homeless every now and then because the homeless are created in the Imago Dei. That's great and that's true, and it's awesome that you do that. But are you realizing your employees are created in the Imago Dei? So the way that you hire, the way that you fire, the way that you do all of these things, are you honoring those principles as well in the treatment of employees? Are you letting the bottom line dictate that? Well, Jesus walks the earth with 12 disciples. Most of them are idiots. They just are. I mean, I always say I don't want to be a Peter. I want to be a David or, it's one of those if I had to pick a character. I'm such a Peter. Peter's the guy that goes from 1 minute, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, and upon this rock I'll build my kingdom and all this. And 2 minutes later, Satan get behind me because he's, popping off on something else. And I say it jokingly, but seriously, if you were an employer in the role of Jesus and you spent 3 years with the 12 guys he spent with, how many of the original 12 would be with you at the end of 3 years? If Jesus were doing his hiring and firing based on bottom line principles, based on even not complaining, all of these things, how many of them would be with Jesus at the end? And yet God uses those men to spread the gospel in powerful ways. I think sometimes that's another biblical principle. We see God is long-suffering. Which means we need to be slow to hire. But I disagree personally with the principle slow to hire, quick to fire. I think we need to be slow to hire, and then unless it's a direct violation of something, of ethics, of all those things, then we need to try and work with people to help them develop into who they could be. And it's weird because in business, it's funny, a lot of the guys who run business have that entrepreneurial spirit also love sports, and yet two totally different approaches. in sports, how many people become stars in their third, fourth, fifth year of being in the league? Right? There's a developmental process that's afforded to them before they become the great stars and the great producers. And then in business, we really want people to move and shake. And so how do we build businesses around biblical principles that treat our people differently and that treat our clients differently and that treat other people differently? Hey, I say to a vendor or say to a client, hey, we're going to do this for you. And suddenly my ability to fulfill that costs me. I overpromised. Whatever the situation is, the fact that I can legally or ethically get out of it, okay, that's great, but so can everyone else. Or am I going to bite the bullet and go, no, I'm going to stand for something more in what I do?
Yeah, it's, and I think a lot of it is what we model, right? So one of the things you mentioned, Jesus walking with his disciples, he was modeling a lot of things for them. Mm-hmm. And so how do we as leaders model kindness, the ability to call out shortcomings? You know, he was not afraid to call out shortcomings.
Right.
You know, hey, Peter, get behind me. What you're saying's of the devil. And you're not hearing from the right source at the moment. He challenged that right there in that moment, you know. And you often hear management wisdom is to not confront people in front of their peers. He did, especially in that moment. But sometimes you have to because of the impact. What Peter said was about to become very poisonous in the ranks if it spread, right? So he had to address that in that moment in front of the peers that heard it. I generally agree with the idea about, you know, correct in private, but
there are times when that's not what's there. And, and you, as you're sharing that, I think about two others that I think are biblical principles that I don't always see fully practiced. One of those is conflict resolution, like dealing with conflict. Mm-hmm. Scripture has some pretty clear principles about how we're supposed to deal with conflict. Mm-hmm. And the principles itself is a process before there's a separation. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, are we willing to journey with people? Look, you and I are both old enough in our lives at this point, we can look back over our life and we know the ebbs and flows we've had in life because of things that have come our way. We've not always been on our A game. These things happen in life. I'm so thankful that I have a God who is patient with me. I'm so thankful I have a God who loves me at my worst and loves me at my best. I'm so thankful I have a God who has seen me through all of those seasons. I want to reflect that to the people I work with to say, hey, maybe they're just going through a bad season right now. How do I invest in this rather than just cut my losses because I can and it's an okay thing to do? So I think, do you have a plan for conflict resolution? And what I see a lot of people move to is, no, we don't have conflict. We have conflict avoidance. And so if there's conflict, we're going to let that person go. Well, that's frankly not a biblical principle. It doesn't line up with Scripture. And another one is God is no respecter of persons. So how do we treat our vendors and our employees and our people with as much of the same expectations across the board? Mm-hmm. Because most people who work at companies, you know, there's the teacher's pet, or there's the favorite, or there's the person who gets away with things no one else gets away with. And that just, to me, seems to be out of line with leading by biblical principles.
I tell people, I'm extra kind to janitors. And they want to know why. And well, there's two reasons. First reason is I was one in college. Because it was a part-time gig I could do kind of in the evenings and weekends and focus on school. Second reason is Jesus says the last will be first in the kingdom. And since we tend to look down on janitors in this life, they're probably going to be rulers in that life. So I'm extra nice to them so they remember me in eternity.
Yeah, that's good. But even as you're saying that, I think about, okay, how does that, the last will be first, the first will be last? How does that work with how we set up, you know, privileges based on tenure. I get it. Hey, I've been here so long, I've earned this, or I have so much experience, I've earned this. Well, a lot of times that's demoralizing. And we face a real crisis currently, generationally, where younger generations are more separated from older generations than ever and are very unwilling to listen to the wisdom. Like I stand on the shoulders of giants, of people who've gone before me, of people who mentored me, of people who poured into me, right? So thankful for that. But we have a generational, more than a generational gap. That's a whole sociology conversation we could have another day. But we have this younger generation. What are we seeing they're doing in the workplace? They're not staying. They're quiet leaving, quiet quitting. They're doing all of these things. And if you start listening to what they're saying, they're like, I have the same job description as Joe, who's been here 5 years, but I'm not given the same respect of Joe, who's been here 5 years. I'm not given the same opportunities as Joe, who's been 5 years. And look, I get it. People watching this may be going, well, that makes sense. Well, yeah, you're right. In the world's eyes, that totally makes sense. In the kingdom, it doesn't.
Yeah, Jesus tells the parable of the guy that hires people at the beginning of the day, hires them throughout the day, and hires them in the last hour of the day, and they all get the same pay. And frankly, as a business guy, growing up, fairly technical and judgmental even, I was like, that's not fair.
Exactly. I get it. Like I'm sitting here talking about this and like, there's conviction, like I'm getting convicted as we're talking about it. Right. Cause they're like, oh, crud, you're putting this out there and now you got to go,
go live it.
You got to go live it. But look, the gospel's disruptive. If the gospel doesn't disrupt how I lead, if it doesn't disrupt how I treat employees, if it doesn't disrupt how I treat vendors, if it doesn't disrupt how I treat clients, I'm just an ethical business. And I think there's a stage beyond that is a life-giving business, that is a disruptive business, that is a blessing to others at a much higher level. But there's a call to that is high.
I want to camp out on this idea of letting somebody go, because my experience has
We've all had to do it.
Yeah,
let's just be clear.
Yeah, my experience has been all business leaders. Now there's exceptions, but let me not say all. The majority of business leaders that I've interacted with or been close to, whether they're of faith or not, whether they lead with their faith, out in the open, or whether they claim to have no faith, have difficulty firing people. And it seems to be especially true in those that are trying to run business according to biblical principles. They seem to have a difficulty letting people go. It's been my experience. I'm not saying that's the rule.
Do you think it's a difficulty with letting people go or a difficulty with how to let people go? Because those can be two separate things.
I think it's probably both. But what I can tell you is the default is kick the can down the road.
Yeah.
Right. And then they say, well, I'm doing that because I'm trying to be gracious.
Yeah.
Well, no, you're not addressing the problem. And
comes back to conflict resolution.
Right, which is what triggered this thought. And you're not addressing the problem. They're not particularly committed to change one way or another. I'm not saying they have to be. I want to get your thoughts on that. And regardless, this toxic relationship is in place for some days, weeks, months, in cases, years. I was in corporate life, a bunch of I'm sure there was some churchgoers in the mix, but it wasn't obvious that there was a lot of them. It took us, because of corporate policy, trying to be ethical, took us literally, Fortune 500 company, 2 years to fire a guy falling asleep drunk at his desk in the middle of the day, right? Because they wanted to, he was a minority, had fallen on hard times, wanted to give him a second, third, fourth chance. Like all great stuff, right? And these weren't even guys professing to be Christian leaders that were extending this grace, right? But 2 years?
Yeah.
Like at some point you got to call it.
Yeah. I think, I've been there. I've been on both sides of that coin too, just to be honest. I've fired and I've been fired. So I've been on both sides of the coin. Let's just put it out there, right? I think, yeah, it's always easier to fire someone when they've done something so blatantly inexcusable, right? Those are the easy ones. It's the performance over time, I think, is probably the one that's the toughest to do. And my question then is have you walked through a process of trying to guide them, equip them, grow them? But here's another question. Do you have realistic expectations for them? I think sometimes as business owners, especially smaller business owners, which, let's be honest, there's some significant asset size, what we would call small businesses, right? We can project onto employees an expectation of work that is flowing from how we're driven, but may not be how they're driven. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a lot of what you're seeing in the generational thing. At least it's what's being said, is this younger generation saying, I want to go to work and do my job, and then I want to have a life outside of that. I'm not interested in, seeing how fast I can claw my way up the corporate ladder and who I can climb over to get there. Mm-hmm. And I think that breaks our brains a little bit, because the person who just comes faithfully to work every day and does their job and nothing else, we generally will begin to look at that as a negative. And I'm not really sure why. Again, back to biblical principles. Mm-hmm. Those to me seem to be some pretty solid characteristics. I remember I was on executive team at an organization at one point, and me and another guy were responsible for doing everyone in the organization's annual reviews. And so we had split it up, and then we each did each other's annual reviews. And he's a good friend, and we did our annual reviews, and I got so mad because on several categories, he marked me as satisfactory. And I was like, this is the end of the world. And we had at it. We had this great conversation. He's like, you do get that's a good thing. Satisfactory means you've done what you're supposed to do. And even the way we do reviews, we have 2 or 3 categories above satisfactory, mm-hmm. that we want people to
excel,
to move into these other things. And I did too. Like, how dare you say it's satisfactory? And so I think that's an interesting paradigm of what are our real expectations of people in line with kingdom, in line with helping them be stewards of their time, talent, treasure, testimony, temple, these things, right? So if they're content to make the same pay for a long time and just come in and do their job, why do we see that as a negative? Mm-hmm. I would think reliability, consistency, like these things seem to me to be good biblical principles, mm-hmm. to be good things we should be looking for.
You mentioned a moment ago about we need to have a process for dealing with a troubled employee or a low performer or somebody that maybe should be exited. Those weren't your words, but that was kind of where we were at. What have you seen work? Like, for those in the viewing audience are going, hey, I'm that guy. I'm not really good with conflict resolution, or I got this person I need to let go. Yeah, I don't have an HR background. I'm not really sure.
So I'll tell you a couple of things I've seen not work.
Okay. One
is no process. We've just come to an impasse, and typically one of the two parties feels totally blindsided by that. Mm-hmm. So that's a problem. Secondly is better than the first option, but is, hey, we're setting out a series of guidelines for you. You're going to have 3 months to do this. We're going to do reviews and everything. But when that conversation then is one directional, right? Mm-hmm. We are giving you this, not first we want to hear where you're at and why mm-hmm. this is that mm-hmm. way. I think that can be problematic, because sometimes it can be things that we may not know. And Joel, I've lived through this one, and you'll know the story because we're friends. And this is not a slight on anyone, but maybe there's something medically going on and you don't know. Mm-hmm. right? And performance is falling off because there's something medically going on. But that's not viewed as how does that put us as kingdom-minded people? Right? Maybe it's, they haven't shared with you that their spouse they just found out their spouse has been cheating on them, and they've moved out and they're living at a friend's. And they don't want to bring that to the workplace. But it's affecting their performance. And now we come in and go, well, you're going to lose your job in 3 months if you don't do this, 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 and this. I think conversation, let's mine through this. So before I think you can even start any evaluative process, there needs to be a process of figuring out, hey, we want to journey with you and we want to know what's going on.
I saw a boss model this probably 25 years ago. He had a lady working for him on our team that had a son that had some special needs that kind of cropped up overnight. And so it caused her to be late some mornings or to miss more work than usual. And somehow I ended up being in the office when they're having this conversation. And he basically probes a little bit and, and gets her, he says, we're seeing more of this is what I'm seeing from my side. And I understand from you, it's your son is taking more care than you were prepared to give when you committed to being part of our team. And she said, yes. And he goes, okay, I'm willing to work with you in that regard. But when it comes time for annual pay increases, please don't expect one, because I'm going to go out of the norm and let you miss more than I'm going to let all the other employees miss. And I'm going to give you a little more flexibility than I give all the other employees. But you're going to keep the job here, you're going to have to burn off your personal time. You're going to probably have to save your vacation time to take care of your son. And I'll give you the occasional, come in tardy or call in at the last minute or whatever. But don't expect a stellar performance review and don't expect a pay raise. And that's the best I can do. And that was, could he have done more? Could he have done it differently? For a former Marine, I thought that was really
step in the right
really
direction.
big of him, right?
What was the reaction?
And she took it hard in the first few seconds,
Sure.
but then she got quiet. She goes, "That's fair."
Yeah, well, and it brings the other person up. The other person then can decide, well, I may come in late, but if I have to come in late, I'm going to stay late. Now you're having a conversation. Hey, if I had to come in 20 minutes late, well, can I still be on the list to get a raise if I stayed late? Now you're in conversation, right? Now you're in a dialogue instead of a direction, and I think that's crucially important. And then and I think there's then the aspect of when we let people go. How do we do that in a way that honors our faith?
Well, before the step of letting them go, I had another client. I consider him a friend these days, but probably 8-10 years ago, he had an employee that was really gone off the rails, like was crossing ethical lines and other stuff. And but rather than fire him, because he had been bold about, hey, I'm a person of faith, he's trying to show a little bit of grace in the situation. So he said, look, it's Friday morning. You've blown it. You don't seem to really care. And these are my words, not his, because I'm trying to protect, because some people listening might be able to figure it out if I give too much information. Anyway, he says, I'm sending you home with pay. Maybe it was a Thursday. I'm going to pay you to be off tomorrow, Friday. And I'm going to pay you to think about your contribution here, what you'd like to contribute here, what you'd like to look like this going forward, and your thoughts around this situation. I'm going to put my thoughts together, and we're going to have a meeting on Monday. And I want to hear what you have to say, but I want you to put it in writing. And what you're willing to contribute going forward, and how would you like to continue to work together. And I'm going to make my notes. And at the end of the meeting, I'll make a decision. And I thought, what a honorable way to give them a weekend to reflect, pay them on Friday, just stay home, don't come to work, think through this. This is a big deal but I'm not going to fire you on the spot. I'm willing to extend grace. I'm willing to extend forgiveness, but we're going to decide on Monday, but I'm going to hear first what you have to say. And I thought that was huge.
I think that the crux of this for me is not that there's this formula that we can say, here's 7 biblical principles to being a marketplace ministry and not a motto-driven ministry. So I just want to be really clear on that. And it's not to say that there aren't people who need to be fired. There are people who need to be fired, but as they're being fired, they need to be fired with the recognition that they're created in the Imago Dei. And by the way, the verse that you were, reading with your Bible study this morning about you're God's masterpiece, it applies to them just as much as it applies to you, and you need to help them discover their masterpiece, right? I think that the question is, in all of these different things, are we struggling with these questions? Or we become so content with, I'm a believer running an ethical business and I can quote a bunch of Bible verses, therefore I'm in marketplace ministry. And to me, that just doesn't cut it. We have massive impact as leaders, as business owners, in the lives of people. And when I read the word, it tells me that every time I have interaction with someone and every time I have influence and impact in their life, I have the opportunity to be a reflection of the glory of God or a deflection of the glory of God. I'd rather make a little less money and have the glory of God somehow reflected through me despite my brokenness, and there's plenty of it, than to find myself on the other side of the coin.
I had a leader and a boss one time say, he says, you mentioned hire slow. You mentioned how we hire and how we fire matters. And his thoughts around that was, he said, I believe, and this was his belief, that I'm going to have to stand before God one day and give an account for everybody that I hired that I shouldn't have, and that I fired that I should have kept. And he goes, that really weighs.
Yeah, and I'll tell you a transformative moment for me, like that. The fact that we have to stand before God and give an account for everything is terrifying. But it's a healthy fear of God. And so for me, I was serving on staff at a church on the executive team, and it may not seem like it after this conversation, but for most of my early years and younger years, and not till that long ago, most people would tell you I did not have the gift of mercy. I was out of line, you're out, right? I was very much cut and dried, very much living within the parameters of what's legal and how do we build the best organization. Generally, that was about promoting myself even more than anything, if I'm honest. But it God had been working on me. And so I was on staff at this church and just been praying for a while. God, I just want to be a better pastor. I want to be a better shepherd to people. And I was praying that and thinking about people in the congregation. And one of those handful of times when I just felt like God, I woke up in the middle of the night, and I'm not a big God said, like I don't go in that direction, but I woke up in the middle of the night. It was one of those times when, man, it was just, the message was really clear. And it was this: how can you pastor your people if you can't pastor your staff and you're not willing to do that? And it radically shifted things for me. And that's where a lot of this flows out. I realized I was demanding things of staff that I might not talk to them for 2 or 3 weeks and then come in, and because I had the ability and the position to come in and go, hey, I need this, or hey, I need this. And I just changed it. It was a simple change every week, making sure I spoke to every single person on our team. Walk in, hey, how are you doing? Is there anything I can do for you? That one simple step begin to change my leadership and begin to change everything. And so the realization of it starts the closest to us and it expands out from there. And so I think the same thing is true in marketplace ministry. Starts with our team and our people and how we love them and how we care for them. And then it overflows to our vendors and our clients and our other people. And my fear is when and I've seen it, but when I see organizations that are holding to this marketplace ministry sort of theme, but their thinking on it is almost completely focused outwardly and not inwardly on how they're caring for their people.
Yeah, there's an organization was started by a business owner who helped launch it called His Way at Work. And he said what they found in various organizations, various size companies, is the employees are like, well, great, we're digging wells in Africa, but I need a new tire on my car, right? And so what they realized was we got to start at home, and care for our employees. And if we care for them well, then they'll help us care for the community well and the world better. But if we're off, doing these wonderful things in a third world country, are those needed? Yes. Are they good? Yes. But the employees were almost negative about the opportunity to bless somebody on the other part of the planet when they're like, I'm paying my bills and I'm showing up on time and my tire blew out last week and I'm running on a spare and I don't know where to get the cash to get the new tire. And so they're like, we had to shift our focus to like, you woke up in the middle of the night. If you're not taking care of your team, how can you expect them to take good care of their people?
And now you're talking about a place where we've gone to a full other extent here, right? Which is in being disruptive and living out my faith in the marketplace. There are possibilities that there are times that to do that, you have to spend time, effort, whatever, to still fit within the world standards legally. So this would be an example. Because you can run into, if you start providing this for them, well, now you've got additional taxes, you've got, right? There's a trickle down of these things that can begin to flow out of that. But here's the beauty. There's also solutions to those things. If you're willing to go out there and do the work to do that. And I know of a similar story of an organization who they had an employee who had a child who was sick, and the employee actually ended up leaving the organization. Their child was sick, was having to go to treatments every week. I mean, it was a serious sickness, and they were mounting all these medical bills. But because they were an employee, they didn't want to deal with all the hurdles of trying to, help them and taxes and all these kind of things. But at the same time, the organization was doing something for, I believe it was St. Jude's or something, a raise for them. And the employee was finally like, I'm in need right here. Hey, do you see me? And I mean, that's I think it's one of the beauties of the gospel. And the stories we see in reading the gospels is, yes, Jesus healed people. All those things are great. But part of what makes his healing so powerful when you look at the individual stories is some of those were people that the healing as much as anything was that they were seen. That Jesus saw them. The man who's been at the well of Bethesda sitting there for years and Jesus sees him. The woman with the issue of blood who's been stuck in her home and Jesus sees her. I want the people I work with to know that they're seen, not just when they do well, but all the time, because they're created in the Imago Dei, in the image of God. Their worth is great. Their dignity is great. And part of my calling and getting to be a leader is how do I draw out as much in them for the glory of God as possible with whatever gifts, talents, and resources I have. I think that's when we start living in a different place.
That's good. That's really good. Josh, thanks, brother.
Absolutely. My privilege.
Let's continue the conversation next week.
Sounds good.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of A Leader's Journey podcast. If you enjoyed it, give us a thumbs up and remember to subscribe to our channel.